Are we getting ready to start? Because we're running a little bit late. Good morning. Apologies for the late start of this meeting. We're running a few minutes behind. First of all, if we could start with introductions. My name's Councillor Louise Brown. I'm Vice Chair but chairing this meeting.
Nicola Perry, Democratic Services.
Mark Howcroft, Assistant Head of Finance.
Tyrone Stokes, Finance Manager for Social Care.
Julie Boothroyd, Chief Officer, Social Care, Safeguarding and Health.
Councillor Phil Murphy, Cabinet Member for Resources.
Roger Hoggins, Head of Operations.
Councillor Roger Harris, Cresson Ward, Abergavenny, and member of this committee.
Martin Grokert, member for Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny, and I'm also a member of this committee.
Jane Pratt, Councillor for Llanelli, Hill, Gilwan and Clydach, and member of this committee.
Sheila Woodhouse, member for Growfield Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Thank you. Could we have apologies for absence, please?
Yes, we've received apologies from Councillor Pavia, Councillor Blakeborough and Councillor Edwards.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest? No. Public open forum. I don't think there's anybody here from the public, so we'll move on from that item. Item 4, which is the capital strategy assessment and capital budget proposals. If I could hand over to Mark to give us a report on that, please. Thank you. Presentation on that. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, members. The report is generally twofold in nature. The first part of it is largely that we have a new responsibility placed upon us this year in terms of developing a capital strategy. That capital strategy comes into effect next year and requires us to actually have a look at our resources, tying those resources to the various strategic documents of the Council, and prepare usually a 10-year capital forecast and strategy to supplement the normal 4-year medium-term financial plan. What we're required to do in the interim is to assess our current practices and admin procedures in terms of being synonymous with that requirement and whether anything needs to change. So a lot of the explanation in the forefront there explains the nature of the capital projects that feature in the capital programme. It describes the approval routes, and full council being the only body that can add anything effectively to the capital programme. So the Constitution doesn't provide a delegation to Cabinet to do so. It explains the officers' working groups behind the scenes in terms of how we evaluate projects before they come to full council. And actually, interestingly, you may remember that actually full council have set itself the condition that to add anything to the capital programme, it either needs to pay for itself, i.e. through prudential borrowing and provide a revenue stream to afford its borrowing costs, or it needs to be of a higher priority than something already in the capital programme and replace it. How we get usually that second condition manifests itself is that where there is any repair work of a specific nature, often we allocate money from the recurrent property maintenance budget within the capital programme that's about 1.9 million a year. So that's how that takes effect. But it was noticed that probably one of the weaknesses in our approach is that where we've explained to members that the question is one of a priority setting, i.e. should it replace something already in the capital programme, we haven't provided any guidance or framework for members to consider what is a useful priority. And in the report there is a table there which actually indicates the relative priorities of various aspects. So it starts off looking at things like wind and weather tight and health and safety considerations and meeting our regulatory requirements, which it says in considering any capital works, that should be our first priority. At the end goes on to explain that actually the use of capital in relation to budget setting, because obviously if we haven't set a balanced budget a balanced annual budget for the forthcoming year. Effectively, we're barred from making any decisions until we've done so, so it recognises that importance. It then goes on to highlight the importance of the Council's corporate plan and aspirations, so the 22 for 22 model and what's important to members. And then it explains a number of categories whereby capital can sometimes be used for things like levering in extra resources or match funding, grant funding, etc. Would say that when I've actually asked for a view from other select committees, most of them are happy with the priority ranking, other than perhaps levering in external resources from elsewhere, which they think actually ought to be a higher priority than I've allocated in that. So that will feature probably in the final version sent to full council at the start of March. In terms of specific capital programmes, the capital programme is built on a steady state. So what we look to do is to roll over this year's budgets. So there's a standing budget for things like disabled facilities grant of 600,000. There's an amount allocated for county farms maintenance, property maintenance in general, which are all rolled over at the level in the budget for this year. The reality is that where we know that there are inflationary aspects, this allows for no obvious growth, but you'll appreciate that the single biggest capital programme item for the last couple of years has been the Council's future schools aspirations and building 2 secondary schools at a cost of £90 million. So that kind of uses up a lot of the flexibility that we have to allocate or volunteer additional schemes in the programme. But we are actually volunteering 3 changes for next year, recognising the importance to have up-to-date information on which to base health and safety requirements. We're reintroducing the survey budget explicitly to bring that information up to date. I'm also proposing to, behind the scenes, split the property maintenance budget between direct works and staffing time so that members can, in time, get a better appreciation of the level of works that that budget creates and the amount of recharge that's involved in it. And the third aspect you'll be pleased to know is in relation to the Seven View replacement. We appreciate that actually as a scheme, I think it's come to this meeting before now, that actually that building is close to its economic useful life, isn't particularly easy to adapt or bring up to current standards, and actually understanding that there is a dementia-friendly housing development being proposed for Crick Road. The proposal was that this feature on the replacement home feature on the employment land in that area to be synonymous with that development. At the moment, we still haven't received final cost certainty around bids and tender arrangements, but what we have got in advance of that is an understanding of what the project is likely to cost. And at the moment, it would be fair to say there is a shortfall. So one of the things that we've actually done is we've actually allocated and got approval for £300,000 worth of capital receipts to be utilised in the eventuality that the project isn't balanced. So the project still has to meet the requirements that it is self-funding, other than to the tune of 300,000. So there's still some work to do with quantity surveyors, etc., and around the spec and scope of things to actually reduce costs accordingly. But rather than it be perceived as a problematic project, getting an understanding up front that there is a net cost to that for members to understand was probably the right way to go with it, so that they've allocated some money. What this means, the report also describes a prediction of capital receipts levels over the next 4 years, and you'll appreciate there's an exempt appendices there in relation to what we anticipate to earn off specific receipts. It's exempt in nature because what we don't want to do is to disclose our negotiating strategy and what we're prepared to take for particular assets in a public arena. That's the only sensitivity to that aspect. But you can see how, as a result of those figures, how the capital receipts levels are predicted to move at the end of this year be £3 million, at the end of 1928 million, and on a pretty straight line basis up for that. I haven't volunteered any wide-scale use of the capital receipts, largely because we realise that members have got an aspect for Tranche B, future schools, aspect in addition to the Crick Road, and if the level of spend is similar to the first tranche, i.e. about £40 million per secondary school, Welsh Government have suggested that they will pay 65% of that and we will pay 35%. Capital receipts probably gives us our best opportunity to finance that going forward. So that gives a general context. From an adult perspective, other than the Seven View replacement and Crick Road care home arrangement, adult usually has a very small capital programme, largely around things like repair and maintenance to some of its sites like Mardy Park, etc. But at that point, I'm quite happy to take any questions.
On a
Yes, thank you.
procedural
So-
point, Chair,
Yeah, sorry.
I just wondered, as we've got an exempt item here, whether we should defer just consideration of that specific point to the end, because we would need to exclude the press and the public, and that means turning the live streaming off. Whether we should just consider that exempt Appendix 5 at the end of the meeting, rather than having to go through
Yeah,
all
I think
the
that's a good idea, and I think the other issue is that we'd like to get to a cross-cutting revenue issue, you know, we've got Roger Hoggins here, and he's got to go at 11, so I'm very conscious of time, so that's a very good suggestion. Thank you for that report, Mark. I mean, I think the basic issue for adults is obviously the Crick Road development in terms of the capital side, and there is a question here that Councillor Pavia has put forward. He can't be in attendance, but he's said, has there been any further update on Welsh Government approving the capital business case for Crick Road? If not, is there a contingency plan in relation to project spend for the rest of this financial year? So I'll leave it to you whether it's either Mark or the Chief Officer, Julia Boothroyd, who answers that.
I may need to pick that up with Councillor Pavia separately. I'm not aware that the council's awaiting any specific approval from Welsh Government to proceed with that, although I do appreciate that part of the money for the care home aspect is intermediate care fund aspect, which is obviously a grant, so it may be a small element of the project that is being considered. What I can confirm is that ICF funding has been granted this year that allows for the land purchase to go ahead, and that's effectively the critical path on this. That has to be spent by the end of March. So the project itself and the build aspect was always anticipated to fall into 1920 and beyond. The one aspect that needs to be secured before the end of March, as I said, to utilise that money is simply the land purchase from a third party.
I'm just going to add to that. Obviously, we've had that approval from Welsh Government. The scheme has been approved funding for 3 years, so in effect we have to buy the land and then there is the funding to build over the subsequent 2 years. But obviously, as Mark says, it's subject to us being able to do that land transaction by the end of March, which we're confident we can do.
Yes, so if I can throw it open to the committee for any questions on the capital side.
I give you a steer on that, having some experience of this in the past. The exempt report is element there is you can talk in generalities. If you start getting into any information that you've seen that the public hasn't seen, that's when you have to move into committee. But if you've got a general query about the level of capital receipts aspect, you can ask them as a matter of course.
You know, from one aspect...
Okay, then, thanks, Councillor Harris, yeah.
One aspect there, we're talking about the value of the land at Seven View. And am I right in saying it's down as approximately 700,000?
It is, but you'll appreciate that we're starting to get into individual receipts now. What I would say is that I'm not too worried about you volunteering that, because the reality is that when that eventually comes for sale will probably be 3 years hence. And whilst I've tried to get an independent opinion from valuers as to what the value of that receipt is. They acknowledge that with the recent bridge deregulation, etc., until they better understand what that parcel of land could be used for, it's very difficult for them to be any more specific than that. I would hope it would be more than that, but that's based on today's values, effectively.
Yeah, I think
Thank
in view of that, I think possibly it's something that we should park at this stage, if that's all right with you, Councillor
Yes, that's
Harris,
fine.
yeah.
We've got 3 years, and I'm sure we can come up with lots of interesting ideas to boost the value of it in over 3 years. The rest of it, as you know, I've advocated that we should continue to press for a 48-bedded setup rather than the 32. So I'll say no more than that. Just to keep that in mind the whole time, and I'm sure that there are prospective partners out there that are willing to help us. I'll leave it at that, Chair.
Yes, thank you. Do we have any update on whether the facility can be larger than the original 32 bed? Please, thank you.
I know when we had the member seminar, we discussed this in some detail. We are still operating on the basis that we're replacing Sevenview with the 32 beds, which is the funding envelope that we're talking about now. But our intention is, and currently is, to keep that door open around the 48 beds. I think we explained as part of the ICF funding, we have already put in a speculative future bid for capital funding for that eventuality. But what we require is a partner to join us who can actually supply the revenue side of that provision. And obviously some of the options that we were talking through were around nursing care, which isn't what we would be wanting to provide, but we definitely see the synergy of both those options. So it's actively being pursued along the journey of our replacement home.
Thank you for that. There's just a couple more questions that Councillor Pavia has put in. I don't know if, presumably, none of the members of the committee mind if I put those forward, do you? No. Basically, it's a question in terms of the DFG, which I presume is the Disability Facilities Grant. Do we need to consider a recommendation from the committee to Cabinet to look to increase this pot of money given demand? And he says he would also like to know a bit more about the backlog in DDA work required. I assume on council-owned assets it's around 7.2 million. How are we looking to reduce this backlog, and where are the greatest areas of risk?
Okay. For the last 2 years, the full council has decided to supplement the Disabled Facilities Grant Programme by £300,000. Its standing item every year is £600,000. For the last 2 years, it's been incurring £900,000, and that budget's been generally fully committed. That was on the basis of housing colleagues explaining to you that there was a backlog of about £500,000 worth of works to do. So you would simplistically suggest that actually that need is met. You wouldn't necessarily advocate it to council because, as I described earlier, it's full council that decides on the capital programme rather than cabinet. But in terms of your considerations, if we're intent to put any extra money there, which is quite rightly your perspective, we will have to work with you to find out where that can be funded from, whether that means an additional use of capital receipts, and therefore potentially they're not available for future schools, or whether that involves a priority change for something that's already proposed to be within the capital programme. So,
Thank you, Chair. Just to confirm that it is Cabinet's intention to try and find the extra 300,000 again. So hopefully we'll be topping it up to the 900 we've had the last couple of years.
So presumably, I think originally the figure was 600, so that means it's going up another 300 then, does it? Yeah. In view of that, I mean, do the committee want any recommendations on that at this stage or not? Yeah, okay then. So if we move on to unless there's any more capital questions to ask about, does it, just as we've got the Chief Officer here, have you got any capital issues that you think are relevant that we haven't covered? I mean, the main one is obviously Severn View. Is there anything else?
No, Chair. I mean, Severn View is the biggie for us. As we've said, there've been other things in the past, but there's nothing that we've got programmed in particularly around capital for this next year.
Okay, so if we can move on to the next item, which is the revenue budget proposals, and if Mark could give us is it Phil? Sorry, Councillor Murphy could give us a
thank you, Chair.
presentation.
And, really, for the benefit of anybody watching in, because all of the members of the committee here have already heard a couple of full presentations. Never mind anything else. Just a bit of the background. Then I don't propose to go into the full budget presentation. It'll be death by PowerPoint after a while. But you're aware that we're going out to consultation with a gap in the deliberations. We still have £594,000 to find, and there's a lot of work going on to try and identify how we're going to find that. I would remind members that if they're going to recommend that we look to take any of the proposals out, it would be very helpful if you could suggest to us what you're prepared to give up, because with very nearly £600,000 still to find, anything that adds to that is going to be increasingly difficult to achieve. And yes, we are proposing things that ordinarily we wouldn't want to do, but needs must. You'll be aware that Welsh Government have cut us by 0.3%. Yes, that's much better than the 1% that it was going to be, but nevertheless, we've still got to find that nearly £300,000 on top of the £5.7 million of pressures within the system, almost all of which were imposed by external factors. So, I think that's enough of a preamble, Chair, just for the moment. I'm quite happy to expand on any of that if members want, but perhaps we'll just concentrate on the items that relate to this particular scrutiny committee, because there will be opportunities, all member sessions next week, and there are still some public sessions in the pipeline. At 5:30 this evening, for instance, we'll be at King Henry School in Abergavenny, and if 5:30. No. It's 5:30. We'll be there, and if anybody wants to come along to that, of course, they're very welcome.
Yes, thank you for that. Looking at, obviously in relation to this report, there's revenue pressures and revenue savings. I was pleased to see in point 3 it mentions about the national living wage, about the particular aspect of that. And I just wondered whether this was obviously not just in relation to our staff, but other staff, and perhaps I could ask the chief.
I can come in on that, Chair. Monmouthshire, as an authority, is committed to paying the living wage, and we, that's embedded in our payroll structure. But because of that, we always, and we've done it for several years now, always make sure that our external providers also stick to the same standards with regards to their employees. So that 434,000 there is the amount necessary to support care home providers in particular, to make sure that their staff are paid at least to the living wage. I don't know whether Julie wants to add anything to that, or Tyrone. But
Thanks for that, Councillor. Just to add to that, the 434 is more specifically around the domiciliary care market, and it is making sure that those employers, as well as care homes, do pass on to their minimum staff that they do pay them at the minimum level of hourly rate that's set in legislation.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to say anything about the 501 that's in there on the next?
Can I come back to that point before we move on?
Yeah, okay, yeah, Councillor Grewcock.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Murphy, I'm glad to hear the reassurance that the living wage is being paid by all our private contractors who support our social care. You'll remember that Councillor Batruni, the leader of the Labour group, raised an issue at County Council a couple of meetings ago, that in Chepstow, within his own family, a worker from a private contractor divulged that she was being paid less than the living wage. I know we were told that that would be looked into. Are you able to give us an absolute categoric assurance that everyone who is contracted to provide a service to the county council for social care is being paid the living wage?
That's one for Tyrone, I think.
In terms of the item you mentioned, that was brought to my attention. I did ask for further details, but never got any of the further details, so couldn't follow that up fully. But in terms of when we set the fees, we meet with every single provider. We stipulate in writing that they must pass that on, and that is checked. So when that query did come in, it was a surprise. But again, when I couldn't follow up fully, because I never had the relevant details.
Yeah, I think if we can move on to the actual savings at the moment, and I'm going to, rather than concentrate on the adult savings, I'm going to look at a cross-cutting issue, which is in Appendix 2, and it's around about page 79, 80 on your tablets, and it's to do with car parking charges, and if I can see what you'd like to raise in relation to that. Yeah, Councillor Pratt and then Councillor Woodhouse, thank you.
Yes, I mean, I think that obviously we're in an incredibly difficult position now, and we've got to look at ways of trying to bridge the gap, which really are starting to leave a very nasty taste in our mouths. And the thing that really concerns me is that some of these proposals might be extremely counterproductive. And we've got a situation currently in the high street where our businesses are, a lot of them are really struggling. We've seen what's been announced yesterday by Tesco. It's across the board, and it's not just about the internet. It's about a loss of confidence amongst the public because of the challenges the country are facing. It is use of the internet, and it's, you know, people's lifestyles are changing, and the high street is changing and adapting at a very speedy rate. I think we're all shocked at how much, you know, the high street footfall has reduced even in 1 year. So I'm just very concerned that things like removing the Christmas free car parking, changing the charges, and instead of being free on a Sunday, that we're bringing in charges. I mean, I regularly go into Abergavenny on a Sunday, and you know, it's not as busy as it used to be. And I think if we start introducing these things, I know we're in a very difficult position, and Councillor Murphy has said, well, what are you going to do to bridge that gap? But I really do feel that this could end up being counterproductive, and in fact the savings we make could be a retrograde step in other ways. I think we've got to try and support our businesses all we can at this moment in time.
Councillor Woodhouse, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got some questions actually regarding the charges for blue badge holders in the car parks, in MCC car parks. What consideration has been given to actually how people access the machines? Are they going to be disabled user-friendly without having to be replaced? Will we need additional machines because of the distances, the prescribed walking criteria for disabled people, how far they can walk to be able to access these machines? How will the first hour concession be administered? That's rather, could be rather a complicated procedure for people to sort of do when they're faced with a machine and have to pay. Castle Street car park, for example, in Abergavenny, we have a shop mobility unit there. So anybody parking there at the moment parks, picks up a mobility scooter and accesses the town with it. They don't have a choice of where they park. They have to park there to be able to access these scooters. So I'm just concerned about the effect on those people. The congestion in the towns at the moment, we have residential streets bordering the town centres and people are already parking there on double yellow lines. The disabled bays, the increase of need for people to use the disabled bays within the town, this is all going to add to the congestion within the streets at the moment. I was going to add about the Sunday parking, but obviously I support everything Councillor Pratt has said about the viability of the high street if we introduce these charges. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Can I add a point myself? In terms of this, that the concern is obviously there was a loss of revenue in terms of the Abergavenny situation with free parking in Morrison's, but there has to be a comparison with other availability car parks in the area. And, for example, in Chepstow, the M&S charge £1 and you get a refund if you spend £10. Now, if you're going to introduce a car parking charge of £1.50 for 2 hours rather than £1 in Marks and Spencer's, it doesn't take a genius to work out where people are going to park. So I think, assumptions of revenue increases aren't necessarily there. Also, I can't work out how 10% when it's £1 10 pence in the car park for 2 hours works out at £1.50 because I thought that's more like 40% increase, but perhaps my maths is not quite right. So if we can, come back to the general question about these car parks, and I'll come back to Councillor Harris afterwards if that's all right. And the cost of making these changes as well in terms of installation of machines and things like that, and whether really it's worthwhile. If I come over to Roger, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, I meant Roger Hoggins.
Oh, Roger.
Yeah. But unless you think there's something, unless you think there's something relevant to add, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I've listed out the various queries raised. The businesses struggling within high streets, I think, was a part of one of the matters raised. That is an issue which I'm sure members will wish to take into account when ultimately they set their budget, because obviously this is part of the consultation exercise. In the actual proposal, it talks about the income being generated from car parking being reinvested into certain services where it's appropriate to do so. That'd be that highways or traffic management, public transport, and so the funding raised will go back into those areas. I think if you look at the budget overall, in this year there are no major cuts in those areas. Because this is forming part of that funding stream. indeed, actually, in the highways, is talk about trying to generate income this year rather than going for cuts. However, the point about the impact upon businesses is made. Obviously, it's a matter of perception and judgment around members as to whether or not they feel their town centres are thriving or not at a particular point in time. However, we, as the consultation goes forward, we hope to be able to provide you with more information about the actual number of properties which are empty, retail properties which are empty, because whilst there may be a perception of there being a lot empty, there's also a view that actually some of your town centres are doing quite well in the general context of a perhaps change in retail more generally, as Councillor Pratt talked about, moving towards the internet. So it's a balance between maintaining the centres, finding a funding stream to do so, and what might remain a reasonable charge. Like ultimately the charge would be £1.50 for 2 hours, and is that a reasonable charge? In the context of whether or not that compares with other towns, Cwmbran is regularly quoted as being a comparator because it's got free parking. The whole dynamics around charging in Cwmbran is quite different because of the way the businesses have to pay for that. And I understand that there are actually, irrespective of the free parking, there are businesses which are under pressure in Cwmbran in any event. Is that purely in relation to car park charges, or which would suggest not actually, and it's more about a more general change. So that's a little bit of a wander around it, but it ultimately be for members to decide as to whether or not they consider that charge to be reasonable. The move from £1.10 to £1.50, Madam Chairman, you're quite right, that isn't 10%, but I believe it's described, it is referred to in the proposal that the charge would be to raise the 2 hour charge at least to £1.50 as an exception to the more general 10%. Christmas free parking, I believe the proposals is to seek support from the town councils to whether or not they would seek to fund that. It does, members will be aware, it does receive positive feedback, and we did promote it this year with signage. There is a school of thought that says actually all you're doing is blocking car parking spaces by doing so, because they can park there all day for free and therefore don't turn the spaces over as they do in normal circumstances. However, again, as I say, it's part of the proposals and presumably correspondence and consultation will go back to the town council to see whether or not they would wish to support it. The Sunday charging, that is quite a change. The proposal is for a flat charge. It's not per hour, it's not the same regime. It's for a flat charge, and I believe that was set at £1 for the day. So again, in the context of being able to park all day, the charge would be £1. Is that reasonable or not? The other, so that is what's in there in relation to Sunday charging. Councillor Wood has raised some questions about the actual implementation of the blue charging for Blue Badge. The car parks are being developed now. The machines are going in now, and in every car park there will be machines which are DDA compliant. New machines are actually going in at the moment, so they will be DDA compliant. That was part of our implementation program in any event. The first hour concession, I think, would be for members to decide at a level of detail, because it can work two ways. It can either be that somebody, a Blue Badge holder, would purchase a 2 hour ticket but would be eligible for 3 hours parking, or there would be a ticket available for the first hour free. So there would be, and thereafter, if somebody wishes to stop longer than that, then they purely buy the 2-hour ticket, but they will again be entitled to 3. So it could work either way. The only addition to this would be for the 1-hour free ticket. In other words, that's an addition to the existing system. It will be for the wardens to check on the eligibility or the validity of any ticket at any point in time. The congestion in streets is a point which is well made. The only comment I would make is, irrespective of whether somebody holds a blue badge, they're not entitled to park and create congestion within a street. If they're doing so, then they can be issued with a ticket for having done so. In the future, after April, it'll be a responsibility of Monmouthshire County Council to maintain manage static parking violations on street. So that may be a matter which we need to address. Quite frankly, irrespective of how your charging regime may work in the future, that may be something which you all wish to look at in any event. But holding a blue badge does not entitle you to park wherever you wish. And if you do create congestion, you may be liable to being fined for doing so. I hope I've covered most of the points, Madam Chairman. We'll pick up any further as they arise.
Yes, thank you. If I can come back to Councillor Roger Harris now, and then Councillor Pratt afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I have concerns about the blue badge charging, and it's just been confirmed that blue badge holders can park on double yellow lines provided they aren't causing an obstruction. I think by definition parking on double yellow lines is automatically causing an obstruction. I can't see any way around that. So I say my concern is that we're charging the car parks, blue badge holders will go out elsewhere, and there are good blue badge holders, and I think they're the minority, and there are those blue badge holders that think they can do anything anywhere, and they don't really help the ones that are in desperate need of parking as near as possible to wherever they want to go. So it's a bit of a hot potato, this one. If we can have assurance that when April comes and enforcement comes into force, then maybe there'd be further ideas that we can explore. But this one really is a difficult one. How to differentiate between those that are in genuine need and those that you see in any car park in a blue badge bay, and out they get their vehicle and stride wherever they're going at a great pace. It is a problem, and I think overall we need to be very careful about introducing this this charge. But let's see what happens. It should be maybe, if we're going to, as a trial period to see what problems do occur. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Pratt now, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would agree with what Councillor Harris has said, and I think also if any of us have either got a disabled person in our family or, we're all only too aware of the pressures that this puts on their carers, and a trip out to the town centre is something which I'm sure really enriches their lives. But it could take somebody to organise the the wheelchair or the piece of equipment in Abergavenny, it could take them 30 minutes to do that and to get the person into the wheelchair, and we're giving them an hour's free parking. And I just wonder, I mean, I was in St Ives at the weekend, which isn't a place that, you know, it's got an acute car parking problem. But I was reading the local paper, and they actually were encouraging disabled people to, how they're going to sort this out is they've got really up-to-date car parking machines, and it will be number plate recognition, I think. So when you go in, if you're a disabled person and you're registered, then you won't have to pay. And I just wonder, you know, how far are we away from the technology where we can actually identify people that Roger talks about that are really in dire need and you know, are severely disabled or, you know, really struggle, so that they still have the benefit of having the enrichment of going down to their local shops and that they're not put off from doing this. And also a lot of disabled people, you know, we may think, oh, £1.50 isn't very much. But if you're on a very tight budget, and, you know, working and employment opportunities are far less for people in this group, then, you know, that can be the difference between thinking, oh, well, I'll go down there or I won't. So I just wonder, you know, have we looked at this technology and how far are we away from being able to identify these people so that they're not disadvantaged? Thank you, Chair.
Would you like me to come back to you now, or do you want to wait for Councillor Woodhouse?
Perhaps I'll pick up on that one then, Madam.
Okay, thank you.
In relation to machines which are going in at the moment, the most modern available for our style of parking, we haven't got ANPR controlled automatic number plate recognition car parking in our car parks. We don't use that. They tend to be on barrier controlled car parks rather than on, well, they are on barrier controlled car parks. We don't have barrier controlled car parks because they go wrong, and you need people to be available to deal with those problems on site. In other words, if it hasn't worked or there's a query, you will find that they are available to you. There is somebody available on site to deal with it. We don't work like that. We have numerous car parks around our towns which have developed over the years, but we haven't got staff available to deal with problems on site immediately. So I also understand, found out recently, that at the moment local authorities aren't entitled to use ANPR managed car parking equipment. It's used by the private sector, Europarks, NCP, people like that. Legislation at the moment, I am advised, is such that local authorities don't use that, aren't allowed to use that type of equipment. The legislation is being changed to allow that to happen. However, there's something called Brexit. I'm not sure what that is, but it's taking up all of the civil servants' time at the moment, and that's, I believe, is actually the case. I'd have to say I was surprised when I heard it, but I heard from somebody in the industry who told me that is the case in relation to ANPR managed car parking. I sympathise with the issue about whether or not somebody's really struggling or not. I'm not sure how you manage that. I would have to say either they are a blue badge holder or they are not a blue badge holder, and therein lies the dilemma really for us to try and manage our way through that. In relation to somebody who practically has to take some time to prepare to leave the car park, then not being facetious, but I would suggest that drawing the ticket is actually the final thing which they do. Practically, that's what they would do. And I'm sure our wardens would be sympathetic to that in managing that, because it will take individuals some time to prepare. I am dealt with that in the past using wheelchairs, so I do understand the point being made. But our wardens would have to be sympathetic to that, and would encourage them to draw the ticket as the last issue they do. I think I picked up on the matters there, Madam Chairman, and will continue to respond.
Thank you. I think it was Councillor Woodhouse, although Councillor Murphy would like to come in. Would you?
Just one last quick point. I am worried that people who have got blue badges at the moment and are very considerate and they go and park in the pay and display car parks, they free up spaces, you know, as I said earlier, the disabled spaces within the town for people who are severely disabled and need to park closer to the shops. I mean, I'm just not happy with this proposal at all, but I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Councillor Murphy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And all I wanted to add really is the fact that I know people don't like it, but this is not exclusive to Monmouthshire. We're one of the last authorities to actually bring this in. We've decided not to do it so many times, but we're now in a position where, you know, what else do we do? And it's all very, very well, and some very, very valid points made here this morning, but sometimes we've got to be a little bit hard. The relatively small increase, I know £1 to 150 is a large increase, but 150 is still ever so cheap. People don't drive 20 miles or so to Cwmbran to save 30 or 40p. You know, this doesn't happen. So there are some problems with this, to absolutely recognise that. It is going to cause some difficulties. We are going to have some problems that we're going to have to deal with. But inevitably, we've got to the stage now where we've been cut so much, and we have cut so much, that decisions are having to be made that we ordinarily wouldn't make.
Okay, thank you. I think to sum up, you know, there has been quite a bit of concern raised about this particular issue. So perhaps to take it a bit further, if we would like to recommend at the end of this report that charging for blue badge holders and car parking be referred to the Joint Select to look at further, if that's supported by the committee. Yeah, I mean, one of my concerns was I did look in detail at the business case on it, and it said it would, this is from memory, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is it said that the car parking proposals would generate 215k, but there would be 100k to install the new machines, and it would only take place in about October, so it would only be halfway through the year. So, you know, there's actually a limited amount of extra revenue for this particular year as a result of this change. And I know, for example, in Chepstow, they've only recently introduced new machines in any event, which has been a capital cost. So if we're talking about introducing a new one, again, I think we've got to think about the capital cost. I know that the report suggests that we may or may not be able to get a grant, but you know, I think these things do need to be properly considered. Did you want to come back on that?
Very briefly, Madam Chairman, the machines going in there are capable of being programmed to deal with the blue badge issue. The charges which are in there more in relation to other car parks. There's proposals in there in relation to Seven Tunnel Junction. There's works to be undertaken there to carry that, to make that car park a chargeable car park. And there's also some time. The issue about only being able to introduce realistically by October is about the amount of time to develop where there's a new car park. But also, if you're going to change some aspects of your car parking, in some instances, you have to do it by a new car parking order. If you just increase the charges on an existing car park, you can do it by notice. In other words, you display a notice and in 28 days the charge will go from £1.10 to £1.50. If, however, you are changing some of the other parts of the order, which might include Sunday parking or a longer day, or blue badge parking, that has to be done by a new order. That has to be drafted, that has to go to consultation, that then has to be advertised, and that has to be implemented. But obviously, so in the first year, there's an impact, but obviously members will be aware that this isn't then an ongoing revenue benefit as opposed to a one-off cost. The cost of implementation, 108,000, is a one-off cost, as members will appreciate.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Councillor Pratt?
Yeah, just a quick question. Can I ask how many blue badge holders there are in Monmouthshire, please?
I'll have to find out, give you that piece of information, Madam Chairman. I don't recall it. I think I have been told, but I don't recall it. I will get that and pass that to you. I would, however, say it's a little bit of a red herring, because anybody with a blue badge, irrespective of where they live, can park in Monmouthshire, and therefore you understand the point, I'm sure. But I will get that piece of information.
Yes, thank you. If you could email the committee on that, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Roger. I understand you've got to go to another meeting, so we'll now put the Chief Officer in the hot seat on on the revenue issues there. I mean, it's not actually very far away, the page that we're looking at. If you just scroll one page backwards, which on that Appendix 2, and it talks about the social care and health changes. There's a number of issues there. If the committee would like to have a look at it, if you can find, have you located the page among these 700 pages or so? Okay then, thank you. Yes, Councillor Grewcott.
I'd just like some information, actually, from Ms Boothroyd. Increase income budget for Mardy Park, and he talks about Section 33 agreement. Not sure what Section 33 agreement is.
Okay, Councillor Grewcott, Section 33 is a legal agreement. I can hear feedback from that. It's horrible. That we have in place around a number of the services that we share with our health colleagues particularly. So at Mardy Park we have a Section 33 for the rehabilitation service that we run there. For example, Mono Vale is a Section 33 agreement for the whole integrated service, and we also have a Section 33 at Sevenview for part of the funding that we receive there. So we have it's a legal instrument to pool money and to deliver services together.
Councillor Pratt.
Yes, I'd like to raise the issue about transport. It's adult transport budget realignment as people use their own transport solutions. And we've heard about this service that is under threat. I don't know whether we've got any later news on that. But this does really concern me because in my ward, you know, there are people who live in Llanelli Hill, Clydach, and they don't have cars. They rely on public transport. Okay, there's not that many of them, but, you know, they are really being penalised. And I'm dealing with a case at the moment of somebody who works in McDonald's and can't get home. And that's another issue to do with when the road's closed as well. But it just highlights, you know, they've closed a bus stop in Blackrock at the moment. And, you know, somebody who really relies on that has texted me and said, you know, why can't I get my bus? And, you know, what does this actually mean? How's this going to work?
Thank you, Councillor Pratt. I mean, obviously, I think you're talking about the general public here. This is not relating to the general public. This specifically relates to people who fall under the remit of social services. So I'll give you an example from the past, say, when we used to run day centre provision, and still we run day provision, but it has a very different emphasis these days. And when we were running those day provision centres, if you like, we provided the transport, we ferried people around the place, etc. A couple of years ago, we revised our transport policy in line with the development of the way in which we're supporting people. Quite a large proportion of people that we support also have their own mobility car, which at times would have been sat on the drive while we were collecting people in transport, hence the modernisation of that transport policy. So this 15k is a, when I say it's a realignment of money, it's the fact that people are using their own transport, people with disability who receive a Motability car, to actually access support in the community or even access our support. Actually, interestingly enough, I was at My Day in My Life yesterday in Abergavenny, and one of the staff was telling me a story about how things have changed and how positive that is. And it was a lovely story, really, because she said the member of staff, picks up the Motability car with two people, one of whom's car that is, and they go out shopping. And she was describing how that sort of liberty issue and how empowering that was for the individual. They're going out in their car with a member of staff to go and do some shopping or whatever activity they were doing. And that was hugely significant. So what we're talking about, I appreciate that wider rural issue around transport and getting to places, but this is specifically for the people that we're supporting. That's where that 15k relates to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And now you've mentioned that, I mean, I was attending a care meeting where this whole issue was brought up, and I think you've just illustrated very well why perhaps we shouldn't be introducing the blue badge charges as well. Thank you.
Yes, could I ask a question on that? Because I did look at the business case on that particular issue, and it did actually say that, this is obviously from memory, reading through all these hundreds of pages, but it did suggest that this was due to newer vehicles and fuel efficiency and planning routes as opposed to mobility. So, I was a bit confused by the answer there.
It is a mixture. What Julie was saying is the predominant part, but also what we've done is based on when we introduced our transport policy, realignment of our services, we looked at our own vehicle stock and we've rationalised that downward, and that's also helped for us to realign the budget as well.
Okay, thank you. Has anybody from the committee got any further questions on this particular aspect? Because there's quite a few issues raised here. There's practice change, fairer charging, threshold increases, respite care and so forth. So are there any particular issues there? Because obviously the savings here, but what we want to ensure is that these savings aren't going to lead to any deterioration in services. So if there's any questions on there, please, thank you. Councillor Pratt.
Yeah, I think we were discussing, Chair, before the meeting about the respite care. And can we have a little bit more information about that, please?
In terms of respite, we charge now under the charging legislation as laid out in the Care Act. At the moment, we charge based on an equivalent per hour care, but that's not what respite is. Then someone stays there overnight. So we're just realigning our charging policy. So we charge a blanket fee for respite care rather than trying to base it on the hour.
Thank you. And can you just explain a little bit more how that, in practical terms, is going to affect people if what they're currently paying and what they'll pay in the future?
In terms of the assessment, there's only a small increase in income of 9,000. In terms of the effect on individuals, is means tested, so they'll only be charged what they can afford in line with the Care Act and the charging legislation. The 9,000, what I've looked at is those people who are currently receiving respite. If they've got an amount that we've said they can afford up to, that's where the additional charge and the additional income has come from.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I think I've got some further questions on that, but if you can come in, please.
I think it was interesting when we did the Access for All forum the other day. I was trying to explain, because there's two sort of sides to this saving in adult services. You know, the total is 1.2 million. I sort of split it in half. The 536, which is practice change, which I'm more than happy to speak about, is you know, is an interesting part. The other is made up of a number of different elements. And some of those elements are about efficiency and also about policy and legislation change that allow us to be able to make some efficiency savings. And I think the respite example is one of those. There is a charging policy that exists that we have to implement. And according to how we implement that, means that we've actually been able to derive a little bit of efficiency from that. Now, I would say, yes, people are means tested, and therefore people do have to pay according to the income that they've got. This isn't about stopping a service or actually getting people to pay more. This is about trying to maintain that service and trying to find all of the efficiency gains that we can to protect a service. So actually, there's quite a lot of creativity that's gone into this in terms of digging into all the holes and saying, where can we be as efficient as we can be? And are there any opportunities for us to maximise that before we start saying, what have we got to save? So I think it's a sort of tale of two halves in some ways.
Yeah, could I come back on that? Because I did read the sort of detailed case, business case on it, and it seemed to say, and I was a little bit confused by it, because it said a per hour charge of $11.95, and then it said, you know, this wasn't quite right because, you know, in some cases it was 12 hours. So I'm not quite sure. You know, for example, if somebody can afford to pay, what difference is this actually going to make in terms of their care? And are we talking about overnight care, or are we talking about going to day care centres, or what? And it seemed as if there was a figure of $11.95 and then sort of about £100 mentioned, and I didn't understand what it meant. I mean, you've said it's means tested, but what I'd like to know is if somebody basically can afford to pay, what's going to be the difference in what they're paying now, and what sort of care are we actually talking about? Because, you know, I don't want us to be in a situation where our respite care is reduced because people can't afford it. And you know, I think I'd like to understand a bit more about what this actually means. If you could explain it in simpler terms, thank you.
The proposal included the SCH 002 and 003 together. We got a charging policy that's born from the charging legislation in the Care Act. At the moment, Welsh Government have put a ceiling on what local authorities can charge for community-based services. The current maximum charge is £80 a week. So we do a means-tested assessment. But if someone can afford to, say, pay £150 a week, that is capped at currently £80. The government made a pledge that by 2020 that would increase to £100 a week, which is where you're getting the £100 figure. My calculations for 1920 look at those ones that we've assessed that can pay the maximum charge. If it was increased to £90 a week for 1920, they could afford to pay more for their services. And then consequently in 2021, if it's increased to £100, that's how much more they can contribute towards their services. And that sort of dovetails into the respite element as well.
Can I come back?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So I think in some ways that's the... Do you want to turn your light on?
Oh, sorry.
That's the technical. In terms of the service delivery, we're talking about respite services for people with learning disabilities who access Bud and Crescent. But that could be the same for anybody accessing services across Monmouthshire. It's the funding regime in lots of ways that gives us the opportunity to be, I mean, clearly people are assessed to pay. They are paying for that because we have a paying system. And in a sense, actually looking ahead and saying, what is that threshold going to move to, gives us the opportunity to programme in what might be the efficiency savings or the income that we can generate from that charging, which like I said before, in lots of ways, allows us not to go anywhere else. It gives us that income, as opposed to closing a service or coming in front of committee and saying we can't afford to do this anymore. It is quite technical, but it is, in terms of the impact on the individual, as long as they're assessed to pay and have the means to pay that, that's the legislation that we're operating under. I don't believe that we're affording any difficulty for people by saying you can't access the service because of your charge. That isn't a feature of this at all.
Yeah, coming back on that, I mean, the line above says fair charging weekly threshold increase from 70 to 80, but in the business case it mentioned 90 or 100. So, I mean, are we talking about, say, a maximum of a £10 increase is for somebody who pays? This is what, per week?
Yeah, for 1920, that shows if someone can pay the maximum charge. If that's increased by £10, that's the income generation, and the same for 2021.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's understandable. Are there any other questions on this particular aspect at all? This particular page, because obviously we're looking at some changes, saving changes. I think the question, if the committee hasn't got one, is about this practice change. Continue the transformation of practice change, and that's got a budget saving of 536,000. So, if you could go into more detail about how that'll operate, because again, in terms of the people who need help. We don't really want the thresholds for their needing help to be raised to the point where, they're in real need. Thank you.
Okay, so members who've been around a little while will be reasonably familiar with the practice transformation that we've been undertaking in adult services for since 2011 really is the year that we've been doing this. And it's very much predicated on a change in practice, the way that we assess people. So I often talk about, pre-2011, when we were making assessments with individuals, it would be very much based on what can't you do and what do we need to fix. And that meant that actually we delivered a lot more service to people. And actually what we learnt when we looked at this in quite a deep way was that actually we were creating dependency, and actually people weren't necessarily needing all of the support that we were, if you like, channeling towards them. So came a very big piece of work that we've been undertaking over the last number of years, which is about actually re-educating both the public and ourselves about what a good life looks like, and actually how can we meet people's aspirations. And often when you have a very different conversation with people, the amount of support that they need is quite proportionate. And we've found that actually we've been able to make the savings over the years to the extent that the adults' budget has either been online or underspent for the last 4 to 5 years. And we predict that practice change agenda will continue. I'll use a couple of examples. Reablement, which is a big part of our delivery. So if you've got a relative who's in hospital at the moment, perhaps with a broken hip or a broken leg, and they're going to come back home, they're going to be, quite debilitated. Our previous stance might have been just throw some services in, and those services would stay there for quite a long period of time. The reablement approach, which is led from a therapist perspective, so occupational therapists particularly, and supported by our home care staff, gets up alongside somebody and says, how do we want to make sure that you get better? And what really are you getting better for, in a sense? Now, in the past, we might have said we wanted to get somebody up and ready for the day, and very much a functional thing. These days, we're very much looking at, so what do you need to be fit for? And it might be fit for to be able to get back out and access all the activities that you've had opportunities for in the past. By doing that, we've actually reduced the amount of service that we need to put into people. It's very intensive, it's got a big evidence base, and it means that actually we are between 60 and 70% of people post a rehabilitation phase of support don't need any support. Well, that's a big change from what we had previously. So the practice change agenda builds on all those different initiatives that we've got, and there are many across this figure. So we're talking about our support to people with learning disabilities, people with mental health, older adult mental health. We're talking about older people generally and people with disabilities. So it's across a broad range of our service. So if you break that figure down, which is what we do, across each of the service teams and our hub teams, it's a smaller figure that they're working towards reducing their budget by, but still maintaining that level of provision and outcome for individuals. You know, it's getting tougher. There's no two ways about it. I think this year, you know, if we were to come back next year with a similar sort of premise, I think we might be in a lot more hot water. We believe that we've probably, and I've said this as well, you know, that we are aiming to get that out. That is not set in stone, because it all depends on the nature of the conversation and the outcomes that we can reach with people. So it might be that we get halfway through the year and go, it's not looking good this year, but that is the estimate of what we think we can continue to drive through the practice change agenda. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. Are there any questions from the committee on that particular aspect at all? No? I've got a couple of questions that Councillor Pavia, who can't attend today, has asked. He's looking at this same page on the budget when it talks about the recoupment of continuing health care and, you know, the 100,000 there, and how realistic is that? And in the bottom item, it talks about discretionary fees and charges uplift, and that's a saving of 93,000. And we're asked, the question he wants to ask is, you know, can we unpack that a bit as to what exactly that means? So if I could just ask those two questions on his behalf, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take the first one and I'll take the second one. So with regard to continuing healthcare, again, it's not set in stone. It is a figure that we reliably think that through our business throughout the year, we could realise. So obviously we're dealing with people who have complex needs, and at certain points along that complex need journey, people's health may deteriorate. Or complexity is such that actually we need to make an application for continuing healthcare to our health colleagues. In the past number of years, we track what those figures are, and this is a realistic estimate for the next 12 months of what might happen in the course of normal business, that transaction across into that health arena, obviously making the saving for us in an ongoing way. And Tyrone will answer the fees.
The fees and charges, some of those are not relevant to this select. For example, in public protection, we charge for wedding ceremonies, licensing of hackney plates and taxi firms. That's also included in direct discretionary fees and charges. What we do every year as part of the budget setting process, we look at all of the fees that we levy and whether we can increase them moving into the preceding year. In terms of the adult select, is looking at what we charge for people in receipt of domiciliary care. Our current hourly charge is £11.95, and we are proposing to increase that to £12.24. We've got income, that's the additional 93, within that 93,000, some of that is reflective in that price increase. Some of it, as I've mentioned before, is outside of this select portfolio, which is increasing fees for licensing of taxis, licensing of other venues and wedding ceremonies and other charges that we levy through our public protection budget.
Yeah, I think I also noticed that there was an increase in the general charges on care homes. Is that within that as well? And again, I think it was about 2.6% or something like that.
All of the charges that we've got for people in receipt of domiciliary care, with the care homes, even though there could be that increase, again, it does go back to means tested. And people will only be charged what they can afford to pay. But the base unit that we use will increase by 2.4%, I think, is in the proposal. I think so, yeah. It was based on a snapshot of what CPI was. At the time, I think it was based on October 2018 CPI figures.
The other question I've got is obviously, you know, as we're coming into the area of care homes, I noticed that there is quite a increase in terms of about 500k because of the allowance that you're allowed to keep in savings, and I'd be interested to know what representations we're making to the Welsh Government, because that's quite a sizable 500k is quite a sizable chunk, and you know, what are we doing about asking for a review of this?
I can take that. Sorry to point out, in terms of the figures, what the government has put in is that increasing to 50,000.
What I'm saying in terms of your savings that you can have before you get charged, yeah.
At the moment now, Welsh Government have stipulated this: if someone's moving into residential nursing care and they're eligible for local authority funding, they can retain £40,000 of their savings. That's increasing on the 1st of April to 50,000. That's not a saving for us, it's a pressure. Welsh Government have estimated what that will cost Wales, and is hypothecated what we get as part of the grant available from Welsh Government is not sufficient to cover that pressure. And that's part of the pressure mandate, the 501,000 for next year, and then 668,000 the year after. There have been some changes since we put this together, but nevertheless the pressure is still relevant, and it is within the proposal to fund that.
And what representations are we making with regard to that? Because obviously our authority may be impacted more than others.
With Welsh Government, as part of the grant, we have to provide quarterly returns. So we stipulate that every time we do quarterly returns. Every 6 months we meet with Welsh Government representatives, and we do pass on all of the issues that are relevant to this authority in terms of us being more affluent, so we do tend to have more people that can retain that capital. Also, if someone was self-funding and the capital didn't increase, they would be entitled to other benefits that they lose when they come over to local authority funding, and that is stressed time and time again to Welsh Government, the impact on us, to those factors in increasing the capital threshold for people.
Yes, please. I was just going to ask if you've got a comment.
My comment would be that, I mean, in lots of ways, this is sort of political in that, you know, we hear a lot from people. When the threshold was much, much lower, people could only keep, you know, I can remember way back, but, you know, up to the 20s of thousands of pounds. Lots of pressure in lots of ways from families to government saying, you know, once somebody goes into a care home, they don't get to keep much of their money. The property has to be sold, etc., etc. So I think there's a bit of a balancing act here against, yes, there's a pressure for us as a local authority, but equally families are saying, you know, how do we get to keep some of the money that perhaps a person has earned through their life in terms of being able to pass on any inheritance, you know, and this is a feature. And my understanding is that this threshold is likely to increase further. So I think it's quite a delicate issue, if I'm honest. Yes, I can see it from the our public purse point of view, which is it costs us and potentially detrimentally could cost us, depending on the demographic of people who are going into residential and nursing homes. But I can also see it from families' perspectives, because, you know, it is about that money that the people have. So, yeah, it's a tricky one.
Could I just ask, I mean, presumably this is, there's a disregard for the capital in the property, is there? Or does that actually, is it separate savings, or does it include both, or what?
It includes both. It is complicated if we get the technicalities. All of the technicalities are laid down in legislation in the Care Act, and we've derived our charging policy. So when someone goes into care, they undergo a financial assessment, and then we follow all of those protocols in arriving at whether we fund someone or whether we don't, and what capital they can retain.
I think unless there's any further questions, we'll come to the end of this report. I think the main thing that we've raised and expressed a lot of concern about is the blue badge and car parking charges. So if this could be recommended as part of the feedback to go to the joint select committee to look at further. Thank you. So if we come on to the if presumably the committee are happy with that recommendation, are you? Yeah, just making sure you're still awake. Yeah, if we go now to item 6, which is the month 7 revenue and capital monitoring report, presumably is that Mark or Tyrone giving that? Thank you.
Would you indulge me just to explain a couple of things about the general report, and then we'll move into Tyrone giving you some specific examples for this committee. So, this report is effectively the report that Cabinet sees. So, as part of your responsibility, you're assessing the adequacies of Cabinet's diligence in budget monitoring. Therefore, you have to receive effectively the same information that they have. But I appreciate that actually in giving members a general understanding of the organisation, which is one purpose of the report, sometimes the adult specific elements are perhaps lost in the commentary. So one comment that we've received from another one of the select is that, well, if we could actually perhaps colour code the specific elements that relate to this committee, it would help you actually understanding which ones is general information for you to bear in mind as an elected member of Monmouthshire County Council, and which is specific in relation to the Adult Select Committee. So we've tried to do that in relation to the specific aspects in highlighting them in green. So if you see any green font in there, you'll appreciate that we regard that as being specific to this committee. So generally at month 7, table 3.12 is appropriate in terms of forecasting an overall underspend of £316,000 surplus. I'd be very happy if that ends the year in that situation. A surplus is more advantageous than a deficit, but it'd be fair to say that 316 is less than a 0.05% variation against the overall budget. So within that figure, I still need to get approval from full council for the capitalisation of certain revenue expenses. And that will be going to the special full council in February. That's presumed £444,000 worth of benefit to the revenue account position, so you can appreciate that actually against the £317,000 surplus, if that's not approved, we would actually be in a deficit position of just over £100,000. Interestingly, it's nice to note that whilst one of the more volatile areas, Children's Services, is predicting £500,000, overall that pressure is being managed by social care collectively in relation to managing that directorate position. Paragraph 3.2.3 is the specific revenue focus for this committee, which indicates an 894k underspend going into the total. Paragraph 3.5.7 covers off the savings aspect that members would have approved as part of the 2018-19 budget setting, and there are a couple of minor savings around Meals on Wheels and registrars that are behind where we need them to be at the moment. The report goes on to explain the capital position. Capital-wise for adult, we explained earlier, the adult committee is not a particularly high user of capital, and the only aspect in the capital programme for 18-19 is the Mardy Park lighting upgrade, which is forecast to come in on budget 23,000. As a general member perspective, there is an overspend on the general capital programme which needs to be afforded in relation to the future schools matter, and it comes down to volatility and not being able to accurately predict at the start of the process the level of asbestos mediation from the ground in relation to the 2 secondary schools builds. So of the extra resources we're getting from Welsh Government this year in relation to capital of 1.3 million, you'll note there that the table suggests incurring 624,000 in relation to either revenue schemes or additional works, and the balance of £700,000 be earmarked largely for the overspend in future schools initially. Obviously, if the figure comes back that the outturn on the future schools is less than predicted, that will release some money to other initiatives. And then paragraph 3.8 starts talking about reserves. There's no specific reserves that this committee has oversight of. Be fair to say that as a council fund reserve, we've set ourselves a presumption that our reserve levels will be between 4 and 6% of net expenditure. Given the situation that's occurring within schools at the moment and moving into a deficit position, we anticipate ending this year at 4.5%. So towards the lower end of that prediction, but still within the envelope for financial planning purposes. And at that point, I'm happy to hand over to Tyrone to explain the adult-specific elements.
Thanks, Mark. In terms of the report, Mark has gone through and highlighted the salient points. In terms of the adult select portfolio, if I look at 3.1.2, the underspend for the adult select portfolio is £943,000 surplus, which is good news. But again, I'd just like to reiterate, it is a forecast. It's period 2 and is based on month 7 data. We are entering into our more volatile months in adult social care, going into the winter period. As you know, with councillors dealing with constituents, that's when we get the drain on the NHS, falls, people needing to go into residential care, people needing more services and more support. But contributing to the £943,000, the majority of that comes from community care. The main savings there, we've got our Section 33 frailty scheme that's given us savings, and we've got savings within general teams. But as a word of note, that is fortuitous because we just, at the moment, we've got some unmet need, and as that need is being met, that will disappear moving into next year. As Mark said, the capital position is not that big within social care. However, moving back to the revenue, we have, as well as delivering a predicted underspend of 943,000, we've also made the majority of our savings attributable to adult social care. If you go to the savings table, savings within adult social care totaled £653,000, of which we are predicting to meet £638,000, which is in line with the practice change mandate. We've got delayed savings, as Mark touched upon, through community meals of 15,000, through additional income generation, through additional meal sales, mainly targeted at the private sector. I'm happy to take any questions or go through in any further detail. Thanks.
Councillor Grucott.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just looking at the Director's commentary here, and it says that the forecast is set to deliver an underspend of 894,000 after savings totaling 653,000. I'm very perturbed that the report then goes on to talk about the position being masked by current 300 weekly hours of unmet need. So that's one thing I'd like some reassurance on. I'd hate to think there are people out there needing our services and not getting them. I'd also like some comment, really, rather than reassurance. Elsewhere, the report does give the warning that we are about to enter the most difficult period of the year for providing adult services. And here, I think we've got that very real need to work hand in glove with the health services. And much is made in the national context of bed blocking and people being stuck unnecessarily in hospital because there is nowhere for the local authorities to put these people. It's good to see that so far the budget is holding up reasonably well, but I am worried about that unmet need. I am worried about the context of our working with the health authority. And I'm also, finally, worried that it only needs one or more of our bigger private providers to go under, and we see nationally they're under incredible financial pressure, and the whole of this budget could be blown out of the water. So on the one hand, it's a nice picture so far, but are they real worries that I've expressed?
Yeah, if I could come over to you. I mean, I think I would reinforce that concern, particularly about the need for 300 weekly hours, and add to that the question of, what are we doing about it, and how can we try to meet that need, and what's the forecast for doing so? Because it's obviously, it's good news that we are coming in on under budget, but on the other hand, if we're not meeting need, they're two sides of the same equation. So if I could come back to you on that, thank you.
Thank you both. Eloquently and well put. It's exactly the dilemma that we have in adult social care at this moment in time. So if I just pick off the issue about, I think we've got to be careful about the language we use in terms of unmet need. A tiny percentage I would describe as that. If I just explain what happens, we have weekly information about how many hours we are able to buy or deliver ourselves and what the surplus is, and that figure moves. So we have probably for the last 18 months or so seen an emergent deficit in the amount of hours that we can gain from the market. And at one point, and I remember this a couple of winters ago, because this is year long now, but it peaked in a winter a couple of years ago, where that demand and that pressure was very much in the south of the county. So we were really concerned about Chepstow. We couldn't seem to be able to get the right amount of hours there. Then that shifted, and it's now sitting over central Monmouthshire, which is Usk and the wider rural areas around here. And actually it's moved into Monmouth as well. And then sometimes Abergavenny will have a moment, but not as bad as elsewhere. So we've got very, very detailed information about where this is, down to the person, and what some of the massive pressures are around this. What we've been doing about this is clearly we're monitoring it. We are actively involved in a number of strands, because this is a complex picture. It's nationwide, it's not just Monmouthshire. So we've got a number of strands that are trying to secure a future that's more sustainable. So some of our work around what we call Dare to Care, which is a big campaign that we're doing around recruitment and trying to attract people into the care sector. And in fact, we were out filming for that yesterday. We're joining up with Social Care Wales nationally to front a campaign around this. But we've been doing a lot of work locally on this. We've been running lots of jobs fairs across the sector. That isn't just Monmouthshire. We're doing it together as a community of interest to try and manage that gap. What happens day by day is what we call relationship management with our providers. So if you're sat in Chepstow and you have 3 or 4 providers that work in your area, the relationships that have been built over the last number of years, really, but specifically in the last couple of years, are very, very strong. And we're able to maximise the offer between what we provide and what's provided in the independent sector to really make sure that we're maximising the routes and that we're getting as much of the care delivery that we can wherever we can. So that mitigates actually quite a lot of more numbers in the system. So that's been very successful. But the issue is that we just don't have enough at the moment. And so the issue about where are those people, because I certainly, a year or so ago, I'd be panicking thinking, well, 350 hours, where are those people? And the common perception is they're all in hospital. Well, they're not. They're all in different parts of the system. So earlier I mentioned reablement. So we're actively doing a programme with somebody, and typically you might be working with someone between 2 and 8 weeks. It varies within that amount of time. So let's say we've been working with somebody for up to the point where they are fully able. We then can't, but they do require some extra support. So I've mentioned the 60% of people who don't need any. Well, that means that there's 40% who do. But they don't need the full support that they've been having. They need what we call step-down support. That's the bit we can't get. So what happens is they stay in the reablement bubble, as it were. So we don't, you don't let people go and say, well, you just have to wait until that doesn't happen. So I would like to reassure you that people, it isn't unmet need. They're just in another bit of the system that actually isn't the bit of the system that they should be in. And it actually then prevents other people from coming into that bit of the system. So particularly around reablement, I think, is a pressure point for us. That's the most efficient use of our provision. That's where we get the best gain for people. Well, if we can't get them in and they have to go straight into more managed support, we've lost the opportunity around reablement. So again, we're doing a big piece of work with the sector to see whether or not we can enhance that offer into the future. That isn't something you turn on overnight, you know, so that's being looked at. And then obviously there are some people who are stuck in hospital. And what tends to happen is, instead of being stuck in the acute, because we're pretty efficient at getting people out of the acute hospitals, so the Royal Gwent and Neville Hall, they end up as longer stayers in our community hospitals. So our lengths of stay in Chepstow Community Hospital and Monivale are quite high. And only yesterday I was talking to somebody who was saying we've got somebody who requires support 4 to 5 times a day with 2 people, and we can't find, and they live in the middle of nowhere, we can't find anybody. So they've been stuck in hospital for a lot longer than we would want them to be. So it's not that people aren't getting care, they're just not getting the care in the right place or at the right level that they should be getting. So this is our life's work, I think. It's what we're trying to resolve every single day, which brings me on to the interface with health. It's a tricky one. We you know, there's quite clearly at the moment in the winter particularly, I mean, it's all year round, but it does peak in the winter. You know, there are ambulances outside A&E waiting to get in. There are people who are stuck in the system who can't get put through. But again, that's a complex picture. And we've been doing some work. We've got a new initiative called Home First, which is an ICF project that's being run across Gwent, where we as local authorities have taken hold of that early turnaround, because we do know that people get funneled towards hospitals and actually they don't need to be admitted into that hospital, but once you've touched the door you tend to get sort of sucked into the tube. And there's been recognition of this. We've done this with our health colleagues, and we've actually got staff now in A&E departments and the medical assessment units actually looking at, so what would we need to do to turn people around now and support them at home. So that's just a number of the initiatives that are going on. So there's lots and lots of work that's going on to really try and address this chronic and at times very acute problem. Trying to think what else you asked. NHS and detox. Oh, and then the state of the sector. I mean, as you will be aware, and I think we've talked about it in here, Allied, who are still called Allied, wobbled and have changed hands in the last bit of time. And that was quite an interesting if not slightly scary period of time, because they were one of our biggest providers. They provide 30% of our support across Monmouthshire. So what would happen if they went down tomorrow? It'd be carnage. There's no two ways about it. But they didn't. We held our nerve with them. It has now, another company has bought them. We've had security during that period. We've got good relationships with that organisation, and things are keeping going. But we have to have a weather eye all the time on where people are, what's happening. And I think, the work that we've been doing around turning the world upside down puts us in a really good position, because we have very good relationships with our providers, and we're able to, in a sense, get up alongside quickly, get intelligence about what's happening, but also share together the care. So I think we're very fortunate because we maximise every opportunity. I think we could have figures that would be much higher than that if we didn't operate in the way that we do. So it's a mixed bag. Yes, there are concerns, but we're all over it like a rash, and we've got a plan around how to put some of this right. But it is complex, and it isn't just Monmouthshire.
Any other questions on this at all? I think I'd like to ask a question, because obviously you've explained quite well about this need for 300 weekly hours, and you've mentioned reablement and other things. I mean, I'm just wondering how much it impacts, say not necessarily coming from hospital, but the elderly who need a little more care, for things, very simple things like helping make meals or companionship and so forth. And I did notice that there was a new private provider that's set up an office in Caldecott, and I just wondered whether any of this, this sort of type of need, whether you've got your standard providers, but whether particularly those who've got means to pay, whether they are being directed to other potential. I won't name the name of the company, but other potential organisations that could help, because I mean this makes a significant difference to people's lives.
I think it's really worth saying that not everybody comes to social services. If you think of a population of 90,000, I can't remember the figure of the over 65s, I should, but we're dealing with about 2,500 people, so we're nowhere near. I mean, a lot of people make their own arrangements, and often people will come to us and ask for advice. We can give that advice. I think there's a couple of things that I want to mention. Obviously, wherever possible, if people can organise their own support, great. One of the things that we've got to be slightly careful of is that sometimes this support, I don't know the organisation that you're talking about, Councillor Brown, but we try and give advice to people about if you're needing support with personal care or anything that's about you physically, then you do need to receive care from a registered provider, because we have had providers set up, and I think there's some brilliant examples of that sort of support, do your shopping, bit of companionship, etc. Great, but often we're dealing with people who are old and getting frailer and might need support, and once that steps into that personal care arena, companies can find themselves in pretty hot water, and we've had a few that have been, in a sense, trying to do the right thing. Nobody's saying they're not trying to do the right thing, but actually to provide more personal care, you have to be registered, and therefore, registered with Social Care Wales. So there's always a bit of a balance. I think the other bit I'd want to mention is our early intervention work. So again, there's a huge strand of what we do in partnership with the third sector and other providers through our housing associations, where we're providing volunteering for wellbeing, befriending, the car scheme that we mentioned earlier. These are areas that we're working in partnership with to support people at what I'd call lower level, and trying to assist people to remain as connected and independent as possible without needing that, the people that are going to fall into the 300 hours. So there's a whole plethora of support that we've developed, again under that banner of the practice change, which isn't just about us delivering, it's about what gets delivered naturally in communities, but us being able to signpost people towards that. And we hold what we call community conversations with the sector, where each of our statutory hubs, if you want to call them that, and our third sector providers come together, and that discussion happens about who's best placed to support somebody, using all the assets really that we have around health and social care. So there's a big piece of work around that early intervention, which isn't really, it is touched on in this, but it's part and parcel of that whole system offer.
Is everybody happy for us to move on? I think the recommendation is just to really sort of note the report and so forth. So I think if...
Right, so Roger Hoggins has come back in touch with some details about the number of blue badge holders. So bear with me. Okay, so the badges are usually issued for a period of 3 years. The number of badges issued in 16-17 was 2,043. 455 were cancelled due to death or other reasons. In 17-18, issued 2,135. Cancelled were 468. In 18-19, that's from 1st of April to date, they've issued 1,626 and cancelled 342. So he's saying over a 3-year period, we have issued 5,804 and cancelled 1,265. According to the Blue Badge report, there are currently 5,467 badges on issue. So it's a lot of figures, but there we are.
Yes, thank you for coming back on that. I think we'll move on. Basically, sorry, is there anything else? Yeah. I think we'll move on to the next section, which is basically confirming the minutes. Yes, thank you very much, Mark and Tyrone and Councillor Murphy. So if we can look at the minutes, basically for the meeting of the 23rd of October, are there any points that you want to raise in relation to these? I think obviously there might be some action points from the recommendations, but perhaps in relation to these minutes we can put that down for the next agenda just to check on the action points that have been raised. I notice on the recommendations, one of them says Select Committee receives a presentation 1 year from now, progress on Mardy local lettings policy, and then it also says as one of the recommendations that the Housing and Communities Manager contacts registered social landlords to investigate the possibility of further exploring the use of empty properties located above shops in the high street for the use of affordable housing units. So we haven't had any feedback on that. So I think for the minutes it's important to just to check on feedback. There's another point in the minutes where it talks about the health board returning to give us to provide more information on Chepstow Hospital and health matters. So there are some actions arising. There's another one in these minutes about the operation of the system to do with record recording, and that hasn't been followed up yet as well. So can I have somebody to approve the minutes? And a seconder? Yeah, Councillor Pratt, Councillor Harris, thank you. But I think just to note that there are some action points to come back to the committee. If we turn to the minutes of the 26th of November, if there's any points that want to be raised in relation to that particular report on accuracy. If not, can I have somebody to propose and second them, please? Councillor Woodhouse and Councillor Grocott. Thank you.
The problem is that Hazel may have updates on these actions, but with her being off, we don't.
Yeah, and I think on these minutes as well, I noticed at the end, on the last page of them, these particular minutes, it says the Select Committee would write to the Welsh Government outlining a case for Monmouthshire to receive additional resources as it is an area of Wales where the local housing cost is higher than other areas of the county. And I think this was in relation to a report to do with affordable housing. And the question is, has that been done? You know, again, that's an action arising, because I think if we make recommendations, we need to be able to chase up to make sure they're actually done. So if I can leave that for those actions on both minutes to be chased up. So if we move on to the forward work programme, where is it? All right. Yeah. Again, you've got a handed out version of this. It mentions a special early meeting there, but we haven't heard anything further on that. So I think at the moment, really, we'll probably just confirm the date of the next meeting, which is on the 12th of March 2019, unless there's anything else anybody wants to raise in relation to that particular programme. You've got a manual copy of it.
Can I just ask a question? Earlier on, a meeting was referred to about a joint meeting for all members to attend regarding the budget. Have we got any idea of what the date of that might be? We've got our joint select committee. That's the same one. Right, okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Pratt.
Chair, so can we assume that, am I correct in thinking the Gypsy and Traveller Assessment Workshop is going to go ahead on the 8th, Friday the 8th of February?
Yeah, is that correct? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So I think that's about it. I mean, we could, unfortunately, Mark's disappeared. I was going to say we could close the session and look at the capital thing, but unless there's any particular issues you want to raise on that. No? Okay, so I'll close the meeting then. Thank you very much for your attendance, everybody. And